What if everything you thought you knew about isolation was wrong? What if the very thing you seek for peace becomes the trap that seals your fate? And what happens when the wilderness doesn't just watch you, but decides you're not leaving? The rental listing had seemed too good to be true. A secluded cabin in the Adirondack Mountains, 3 bedrooms, fully furnished, available for an entire week at a fraction of what similar properties commanded. The photos showed a rustic but well-maintained log structure nestled among towering pines, with a stone fireplace that promised cozy evenings and windows that framed pristine wilderness views. The description mentioned no cell service, a selling point for our group of burned-out millennials desperate to disconnect from the digital world that had consumed our 20s. I should have questioned why it was so cheap. I should have wondered why the owner, a man named Harold Kettering, insisted on cash only and seemed eager, almost desperate, to rent it out for that specific week in October. I should have found it strange that he handed over the keys in a dimly lit diner parking lot, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he pressed the cold metal into my palm and muttered something about keeping the doors locked after dark. But I didn't question any of it. None of us did. We were too caught up in the romance of our great escape, too blinded by Instagram-worthy expectations of flannel shirts and campfire s'mores to notice the red flags fluttering in the October wind. The drive up took longer than expected. What Google Maps had optimistically labeled as a 2-lane highway quickly devolved into a narrow, winding road that seemed to grow more isolated with each mile. Cell towers became a distant memory somewhere around the town of Pine Creek, which consisted of little more than a gas station, a bait shop, and a handful of weathered houses that looked like they'd been abandoned by progress decades ago. The locals we encountered there, a grizzled attendant who pumped our gas in silence and a woman behind the counter of the general store who watched us with eyes that held more pity than curiosity, seemed to view us with the kind of resigned sadness usually reserved for terminal patients. "You folks headed up to one of the camps?" the woman had asked, her voice carrying the flat vowels of rural New York. "Yeah, we rented a cabin for the week," my friend Jake had replied, his enthusiasm undimmed by the increasingly ominous atmosphere. "Kettering Place, I think." The woman's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, a shadow crossing her features like a cloud passing over the sun. She'd rung up our supplies, beer, chips, and enough canned goods to survive a minor apocalypse, in silence after that. But I caught her glancing at us in the security mirror above the register, and something in her gaze made me want to ask questions I couldn't quite formulate. We left Pine Creek behind and continued into the mountains, following Harold's handwritten directions through a maze of increasingly primitive roads. The asphalt gave way to gravel, which eventually surrendered to packed dirt that wound through trees so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon sun. Our convoy of 2 cars, my aging Honda Civic and Jake's pickup truck, rumbled and bounced over ruts and rocks, their city-tuned suspensions protesting every mile. By the time we found the turnoff marked only by a rusted mailbox bearing the number 847, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The driveway, if it could be called that, was little more than 2 tire tracks separated by a strip of weeds, leading into woods so dense that our headlights seemed to be swallowed by the shadows between the trees. The cabin emerged from the forest like something from a fairy tale, and not the sanitized Disney version, but the original Brothers Grimm darkness, where children get lost and bad things happen to those who wander too far from home. It was larger than the photos had suggested, a 2-story structure of dark logs weathered by decades of mountain winters. A wraparound porch sagged slightly on one side, its railing adorned with wind chimes that clinked mournfully in the evening breeze. Windows stared out from the structure like hollow eyes, their glass reflecting our headlights back at us in fractured patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Okay, this is actually perfect," declared Sarah, my girlfriend of 3 years, and the primary architect of this getaway. She climbed out of the passenger seat of my car, stretching her arms above her head and breathing deeply of the pine-scented air. "Look at this place. It's like something out of a horror movie, but in a good way." The other members of our group emerged from the vehicles with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Jake, ever the optimist, immediately began unloading camping chairs and a cooler full of beer from his truck bed. His girlfriend Emma, a perpetual pessimist who somehow balanced out his relentless positivity, stood with her arms crossed, eyeing the cabin with obvious skepticism. Marcus, the lone single member of our party and a freelance photographer who'd brought enough camera equipment to document a small war, was already snapping pictures of the structure's facade, his flash strobing white against the darkening sky. "The photos really didn't do it justice," Marcus said, lowering his camera and grinning at the rest of us. "This place has serious character. Look at the craftsmanship on those logs. They don't build them like this anymore." I grabbed my duffel bag from the trunk and tried to shake off the vague unease that had been growing stronger with each mile we'd traveled from civilization. The cabin was exactly what we'd wanted. Isolated, authentic, far from the demands of jobs and social media, and all the other modern irritations we'd come here to escape. So why did looking at it make me feel like I was standing at the edge of a cliff? The front door was solid wood, painted a dark green that had faded and peeled over the years to reveal the weathered timber beneath. Harold had given me 2 keys on a simple metal ring, one for the front door and one for what he'd called the back room, though he'd been vague about what that meant. The lock was old-fashioned, requiring more effort to turn than I was used to, but it opened with a satisfying click that echoed in the silence of the surrounding woods. The interior smelled of aged wood and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that I couldn't quite identify. The main room was spacious and rustic, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that looked like it could accommodate logs the size of telephone poles. Rough-hewn beams supported the ceiling, and the walls were decorated with an eclectic mixture of antique farming tools, faded photographs, and mounted animal heads that watched our entrance with glassy, eternal stare. "Dibs on the master bedroom," Jake called out, already bounding up the wooden staircase with Emma trailing behind him, her expression suggesting she was already regretting the decision to come. Sarah moved through the space with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to staging apartments for real estate photos, her fingers trailing along surfaces and her head tilting as she took in the layout. "The kitchen's actually pretty well equipped," she called from the adjoining room. "And there's a full-size refrigerator. We might actually be able to cook real meals here." Marcus had claimed the front bedroom on the ground floor, leaving Sarah and me with a cozy space at the back of the house that overlooked the forest through a single large window. As we unpacked, I couldn't help but notice how quickly the woods seemed to press in around the cabin as daylight faded. What had been merely dense forest in the afternoon light became an impenetrable wall of black shapes and shadows, broken only by the occasional gleam of what might have been eyes reflecting our interior lights. "It's so quiet here," Sarah murmured, sitting on the edge of the bed and staring out the window. I'd forgotten what real quiet sounds like. She was right. The silence was almost tangible, so complete that it seemed to have weight and substance. No traffic, no sirens, no hum of air conditioning or electronic devices. Even the wind in the trees made barely a whisper. It was the kind of profound quiet that city dwellers dream about but rarely experience, and it should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt expectant. We spent the day trying to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the attempt felt forced and hollow. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide watching eyes. Every rustle of leaves suggested movement that shouldn't be there. Marcus compulsively checked and rechecked his photographs from the previous night, but his camera had captured nothing during the hours when the figures surrounded our cabin. Just darkness and the occasional reflection of our own lights in the windows. The scratches on the generator shed had multiplied overnight. What had been 3 sets of parallel gouges were now dozens, covering almost the entire surface of the metal door in a chaotic pattern that hurt to look at. Some of the marks were so deep they'd penetrated completely through the thin steel, leaving jagged holes that offered glimpses into the shadowy interior of the shed. "Bears don't do this," Emma said flatly, staring at the destruction. "This looks like something was trying to tear the whole thing apart." Jake examined the damage with the careful attention of someone who'd done his share of home repairs. "These aren't claw marks. They're too regular, too purposeful. It's like something used tools to do this. But what kind of tools would leave marks like these? And what could have worked so quietly that we hadn't heard the destruction happening just yards from where we slept?" The generator itself was still running, its steady rumble providing power to the cabin's electrical systems. But the fuel gauge showed it was nearly empty, far emptier than it should have been after just 2 days of operation. Either the gauge was broken, or something was draining power at a rate far beyond what our modest electrical needs should have required. "We should probably conserve," Sarah suggested. "Turn off anything we don't absolutely need." It was a practical suggestion, but it carried implications none of us wanted to voice. If the generator failed, we'd be left without lights, without the electric heat that supplemented the fireplace, without any of the modern conveniences that made the isolation tolerable. We'd be alone in the darkness with nothing but fire and candlelight to hold back whatever waited in the forest. The afternoon brought clouds that promised rain, and with them a premature twilight that seemed to press down on the cabin like a physical weight. We found ourselves checking the windows more frequently as the light faded, our conversations becoming increasingly strained as we all listened for sounds that shouldn't be there. It was Marcus who discovered the photographs. He'd been organizing his camera equipment, preparing for what might be another long night of attempted documentation, when he noticed something strange about the memory card he'd been using. According to the camera's display, it contained nearly twice as many images as he remembered taking. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, scrolling through the file directory. "I know exactly how many shots I've taken, but the counter shows almost 200 more images." He connected the camera to his laptop, and we all gathered around the small screen as he opened the photo management software. The files were all there, numbered sequentially but mixed in with his carefully composed shots of waterfalls and forest scenes were dozens of images he hadn't taken. The unknown photographs were all taken at night, their timestamps corresponding to the hours when we'd been asleep or trying to rest. But they weren't random shots, they were deliberate, composed images that showed the cabin from various external angles, our cars parked in the driveway, and most disturbing of all, the interior of the cabin itself. "How is this possible?" Sarah whispered, staring at a photograph that clearly showed her sleeping in our bed, taken from somewhere inside the room. "Your camera was with you all night." Marcus shook his head, his face pale. "I don't understand it. The camera never left my sight, and even if someone had taken it, they'd need to know my settings, my preferences for composition and exposure." But the evidence was undeniable. Someone or something had used his camera to document our presence, our vulnerabilities, our complete helplessness while we slept. The photographs were technically excellent, properly exposed, carefully framed, with an artistic eye that suggested experience and skill. "Look at this one," Jake said, pointing to an image that showed the view from our front window looking out at the forest. But this photograph had been taken from outside the cabin, looking in. We could see ourselves gathered around the fire the previous evening, unaware that we were being observed and documented. The implications were staggering. Something had been inside the cabin with us, moving through the rooms while we slept, getting close enough to photograph us in our beds. It had handled Marcus's expensive camera equipment with obvious familiarity, knew how to operate the complex controls, understood composition and lighting well enough to create images that were disturbing in their technical competence. "We're leaving," Emma announced, standing up from the laptop. "Right now. I don't care about the money or what people will think. We're packing up and getting out of here." For once, even Jake didn't argue. The evidence on the laptop screen was too concrete, too undeniable to rationalize away. Whatever was happening here had moved beyond strange sounds and glimpsed figures in the darkness. We were being stalked, studied, documented by something that could move through our supposedly secure shelter without making a sound. But as we began gathering our belongings, the rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally arrived. It came not as a gentle mountain shower, but as a torrential downpour that turned the world outside the windows into a gray wall of water. The dirt driveway, already rough and barely passable in good weather, would be a treacherous mud trap in these conditions. "We'll have to wait for it to let up," Jake said, though his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as the rest of us. Trying to drive out in this would be suicide. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and lightning illuminated the forest in brief, stark moments that revealed nothing but empty trees and falling rain. The storm had transformed the world outside from merely threatening to actively hostile, trapping us in the cabin as effectively as any lock or chain. The power went out just after sunset. The generator's steady rumble, which had been our constant companion since arrival, suddenly stopped. The lights flickered once and went dark, leaving us in complete blackness except for the dying embers in the fireplace. The silence that followed was more profound than anything we'd experienced yet. No electrical hum, no mechanical sounds, just the overwhelming rush of rain against the roof and windows. Jake fumbled for his phone's flashlight, and the small LED beam carved a pale circle in the darkness. "I'll go check the generator," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. "Don't," Emma said immediately. "Don't go out there. Not in this storm, not after what we've seen." "Then what do you suggest? We can't spend the night without power." Marcus had found a battery-powered lantern in his camera bag, and its warm glow pushed back some of the oppressive darkness. There should be candles somewhere, emergency supplies. We searched the cabin by lantern and phone light, finding a collection of pillar candles, oil lamps, and even a few battery-powered flashlights in various drawers and closets. Harold had apparently prepared for power outages, though I wondered if he'd known about the other hazards his property presented to unwary renters. As we worked to establish some semblance of light throughout the main room, Sarah made a discovery that stopped us all cold. "There's another key," she called from the kitchen where she'd been searching through drawers for matches. It was taped under one of the cabinets. She held up a brass key, different from the two Harold had given me, but clearly meant for the same type of old-fashioned lock. A faded paper tag was tied to it with string, and written in Harold's spidery handwriting were the words, "Emergency only." I took the key, feeling its weight in my palm. Harold mentioned a back room when he gave me the other keys. Maybe this is for that. "Where is the back room?" Marcus asked. That was the question, wasn't it? We'd explored the entire cabin, both floors, and hadn't found any locked doors other than the main entrance. But as I thought about it, I realized there might be spaces we'd overlooked. Areas behind the kitchen or adjacent to the bedrooms that could contain additional rooms. "Help me look," I said. There has to be a door somewhere that we missed. It was Emma who found it, hidden behind a tall bookshelf in what we'd assumed was just an alcove off the main room. The shelf was on hinges, disguised to look like a permanent fixture, but actually concealing a narrow wooden door that was secured with the type of old lock the brass key would fit. "Should we open it?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I fitted the key into the lock, feeling the mechanism turn with surprising ease despite its apparent age. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness beyond the reach of our lantern light. The smell that rose from below was organic and unpleasant, the same odor I'd noticed when we first entered the cabin, but concentrated and much stronger. It was the smell of decay, of things left too long without light or air, of secrets that had been buried but refused to stay dead. "This isn't on any of the floor plans," Marcus observed, shining his flashlight down the stairway. The beam disappeared into blackness without illuminating the bottom. "How deep does it go?" There was only one way to find out. Taking the battery-powered lantern, I started down the stairs, the old wood creaking under my weight, despite my attempts to move quietly. The others followed reluctantly, their phone lights creating dancing shadows on the rough stone walls that enclosed the narrow staircase. The basement, if that's what it was larger than the cabin's footprint should have allowed. The stone walls extended beyond the reach of our lights in all directions, and the ceiling was supported by thick wooden beams that disappeared into the darkness above. But it was what filled the space that made us all stop at the bottom of the stairs, our lights playing across a scene that belonged in a museum or a nightmare. The room was furnished like a study or workshop from another century. Heavy wooden tables lined the walls, their surfaces covered with books, papers, and instruments that looked like they belonged in a medieval laboratory. Oil paintings in ornate frames depicted scenes that were difficult to make out in the uncertain light, but which seemed to show groups of pale figures engaged in activities that hurt to look at directly. But it was the photographs that truly captured our attention. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, covering every available wall surface. They were pinned, taped, and tacked in overlapping layers that created a collage of images spanning what appeared to be decades. And every single one showed the same subject. People who had rented this cabin, families on vacation, couples seeking romantic getaways, groups of friends like ourselves, all documented in the same style as the photographs we'd found on Marcus's camera. The images showed their subjects unaware, sleeping, eating, going about their daily activities while something watched and recorded from the shadows. Jesus Christ, Jake breathed, his flashlight beam moving across row after row of photographs. How long has this been going on? Some of the images were clearly old, their colors faded and their edges curled with age. Others looked recent, printed on modern photo paper with the sharp clarity of digital photography. The dates penciled on the backs of the pictures we could examine suggested this had been happening for at least 30 years, maybe longer. Sarah had found a journal lying open on one of the tables, its pages covered with handwriting in various styles and languages. "These are entries from different people," she said, her voice hushed. "Look, different handwriting, different dates, but they're all describing the same things. Being watched, photographed, stalked." I took the journal and flipped through its pages, finding entries in English, Spanish, French, and languages I couldn't identify. But despite the linguistic differences, certain words appeared again and again. Watchers, pale ones, forest guardians, the hungry ones. The entries spanned decades, each one describing experiences similar to our own, but with outcomes that became increasingly disturbing as I read further. 1987. They've been circling the cabin for 3 nights now. We tried to leave this morning, but the car wouldn't start. Found scratches on all the tires, deep enough to cause slow leaks. The pale ones don't want us to leave. 1994. Sarah is missing. She went out to the car for her medication and never came back. We found her jacket hanging from a tree branch 50 yards into the forest, but no sign of struggle. The pale ones took her. I know they did. 2003. Day 6. The generator is empty again, though we filled it yesterday. They're testing us, seeing how long we can last without power. The photographs started appearing under our door this morning. Pictures of us sleeping, eating, completely unaware. They've been inside. They've been watching. The final entry was recent, so recent that the ink was barely dry. 2025, October 24th. New group arrived yesterday. 5 of them, young and unsuspecting like all the rest. The hungry ones are excited. It's been 2 years since the last feeding. I've left this journal where they'll find it, though I know it won't help them. Nothing helps them. Nothing ever has. October 24th. That was yesterday, the day we'd arrived. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "Now, right now." But as we turned to leave, our lights swept across something that made us all freeze. In the far corner of the basement, barely visible in the uncertain illumination, was a pile of objects that looked sickeningly familiar. Clothes, luggage, personal items, the belongings of people who had come to this cabin and never left. And sitting on top of the pile, as if it had been placed there specifically for us to find, was a camera, Marcus's camera. The same model, the same configuration, but older, its black body scratched and dented from years of use. Marcus approached the pile with the slow, mechanical movements of someone in shock. He picked up the camera and turned it over in his hands, his face pale in the lantern light. "This is mine," he said quietly. "I mean, it's the same model I have, with all the same customizations. But this one's been here for years." He turned the camera on and its LCD screen flickered to life, displaying the last photograph taken. The image showed 5 people standing around this very basement, their faces illuminated by lantern light as they stared in horror at a pile of belongings. It was us, taken just moments ago from somewhere in the darkness beyond our lights. "Run," Sarah whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled up the narrow staircase, our lights bouncing wildly as we fought to reach the relative safety of the main floor. Behind us, something moved in the darkness of the basement. Not the scraping or scratching we'd heard before, but the whisper of bare feet on stone and the rustle of fabric that suggested human movement. But when we reached the top of the stairs and slammed the hidden door behind us, spinning the bookshelf back into place, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any noise would have been. because it suggested patience, intelligence, and the confidence that comes from knowing there's nowhere left to run. The storm was still raging outside, turning the world beyond the windows into a hostile maze of rain and lightning. Even if we could reach our cars, the muddy driveway would be impassable in these conditions. We were trapped in the cabin with whatever lived in the basement below, waiting for the storm to pass or for something else to happen. The journal said the cars wouldn't start, Jake pointed out as we huddled around the dying fire. Maybe we should check on them before we try to leave. It was a good point, but the thought of venturing outside in the storm to inspect our vehicles was almost as terrifying as staying inside with our unseen watchers. The photographs had shown that whatever was stalking us could move freely around the property, could approach our cars as easily as it had entered the cabin itself. We stick together, I decided. Whatever happens, we don't split up. We don't go anywhere alone. But even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in everyone's eyes. The basement had changed everything, had revealed that this wasn't just a case of strange wildlife or overactive imaginations. We were part of a pattern that had been repeating for decades. Guests who arrived full of vacation plans and ended up contributing their belongings to the pile in the corner. Marcus was obsessively checking his camera, scrolling through the images over and over as if he could somehow find answers in the pixels. The metadata on these photos shows they were taken by my camera, he said, but I was asleep when they were shot. So either someone took my camera without me knowing or what? Emma demanded. Or something else has been using it. Something that knows exactly how to operate complex camera equipment, that understands composition and lighting, that can move through a locked cabin without making a sound. The implications were staggering. We weren't dealing with simple predators or even particularly clever animals. Whatever was stalking us had intelligence, skills, and most disturbing of all, experience. They'd done this before many times and they'd gotten very good at it. The fire was burning low and our supply of firewood was running out. The candles and oil lamps provided some light, but they created more shadows than they eliminated, and every flicker seemed to suggest movement in the periphery of our vision. The cabin that had seemed so cozy and welcoming upon our arrival now felt like a trap, its walls closing in around us as the storm raged outside. It was near midnight when we heard the first sound from the basement. It started as a soft scraping, like fingernails on stone, but gradually grew louder and more insistent. Whatever was down there was moving around, exploring, and the sounds were coming closer to the staircase that led up to our level. "Did we lock that door?" Sarah whispered. I tried to remember, but the panic of our escape from the basement had driven out most details. I thought I'd turned the key, but in the darkness and confusion, I couldn't be certain. The scraping stopped, replaced by a new sound that was somehow worse, the rhythmic creaking of footsteps on wooden stairs. Something was climbing up from the basement, moving slowly and deliberately toward the hidden door. We sat frozen around the dying fire, listening to the measured pace of the ascent. The footsteps paused at what must have been the top of the stairs, and for a long moment there was absolute silence. Then came the soft sound of metal on metal, the door handle being tested. The lock held. The footsteps retreated, but only as far as the bottom of the stairs. Whatever was down there had confirmed that we were aware of its presence, had tested our defenses, and was now waiting to see what we would do next. "We can't stay here," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "If it gets through that door." "It won't," Jake replied, but he didn't sound convinced. "It's an old lock, but it's solid. As long as we keep quiet, maybe it will go away." But I could see in his eyes the same knowledge that was growing in all of us. Whatever was in the basement wasn't going to simply give up and leave. It had been patient for decades, had waited for the right conditions, the right victims. Now that we were here, trapped by the storm and isolated from any possibility of help, it would see this through to whatever end it had planned. The storm continued through the night, its intensity never diminishing. Lightning illuminated the forest in brief, stark moments that revealed empty spaces where we'd previously seen the pale watchers. But their absence from outside only emphasized the presence we could feel below, waiting in the darkness beneath our feet. We took turns keeping watch, though none of us managed any real sleep. Every sound from the basement, and there were many, brought us instantly alert. listening for any indication that our defenses had been breached. The footsteps came and went, sometimes climbing to test the door, other times moving around the basement space in patterns we couldn't decipher. Dawn came gray and reluctant, filtered through clouds that still promised more rain. The storm had diminished to a steady drizzle, but the damage was already done. When Jake peered out at our vehicles, he could see that the driveway had been transformed into a muddy stream that would challenge even a four-wheel drive vehicle. "We might be able to make it," he said, though his voice carried little conviction. "If we take it slow and careful." But first we needed to check on the cars themselves. The journal entries had mentioned sabotage, and after finding the photographs in the basement full of victims' belongings, we had no reason to doubt that our vehicles had been similarly compromised. "I'll go," Marcus volunteered, though his face was pale with fear. "I'm the fastest runner if something goes wrong." "We all go," I corrected. "Nobody goes anywhere alone." Armed with flashlights and what few potential weapons we could find, kitchen knives, a fire poker, a heavy flashlight that could serve as a club, we made our way to the front door. The morning air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and decomposing leaves. The forest seemed different in daylight, less overtly threatening but somehow more alien, as if the storm had washed away the familiar and left something else in its place. Our cars sat where we'd left them, but it was immediately obvious that they'd been tampered with. All four tires on my Honda were flat, their sidewalls slashed with the same parallel cuts we'd seen on the generator shed. Jake's truck had suffered similar damage, but the vandalism had gone further. The hood was up, and even from a distance we could see that wires had been cut and important-looking components had been removed entirely. "They don't want us to leave," Sarah said quietly. It was a statement, not a question, and its truth was undeniable. Whatever was stalking us had systematically eliminated our means of escape, ensuring that we would remain on the property until it was ready to complete whatever purpose had brought us here. We were walking back toward the cabin, our hopes of immediate escape dashed, when Marcus grabbed my arm and pointed toward the forest. "Look," he whispered. They were back, the pale watchers we'd seen on our first night. But now they were visible in daylight, standing among the trees in a loose circle that encompassed the entire clearing. In the gray morning light, their true nature was revealed, and what we saw made the breath catch in our throats. They weren't human. They had never been human. The figures were tall and impossibly thin, their limbs elongated beyond any natural proportion. Their skin was the color of milk glass, translucent enough that dark shapes, perhaps organs, perhaps something else entirely, were visible beneath the surface. Their faces were the worst part, featuring eyes that were too large and too dark, and mouths that stretched too wide across features that seemed to shift and flow like melting wax. But most disturbing of all was their stillness. They didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't show any of the small movements that characterize living things. They simply stood and watched, patient as stones, waiting for something that only they understood. "What are they?" Emma breathed. It was Marcus who answered, his voice hollow with realization. "They're photographers. Look at their hands." He was right. Each of the pale figures held what appeared to be a camera, though the devices they carried were unlike any modern equipment I'd ever seen. They were constructed of bone and metal and other materials that gleamed wetly in the dim light, with lenses that seemed to move and focus of their own accord. "The photographs in the basement," Sarah said. "They took all of them. They've been documenting the people who come here for decades. But why? What purpose could these creatures have for creating such an extensive record of human visitors? And what happened to the people after they'd been thoroughly documented?" The pile of belongings in the basement suggested an answer I didn't want to contemplate. As we watched, one of the creatures raised its camera and pointed it in our direction. The device emitted a sound like breaking glass, and a flash of light so brilliant it left spots dancing in our vision illuminated the entire clearing. When our sight cleared, more of the creatures had appeared, until there were dozens of them arranged in concentric circles around the cabin. "Inside," I said urgently. "Now." We ran for the front door, expecting at any moment to hear the sound of pursuit behind us. But when we reached the safety of the cabin and turned to look back, the creatures hadn't moved. They remained in their positions, cameras raised, documenting our flight with the same patient thoroughness they'd apparently brought to every group of visitors who had come before us. The door slammed shut behind us, and I turned the deadbolt with hands that trembled despite my best efforts to remain calm. The thick wood and metal lock seemed pitifully inadequate against creatures that had demonstrated the ability to move through the cabin at will, but it was all the protection we had. "The basement," Jake said suddenly. "They came up from the basement. That means there's another way in down there, something we didn't see." He was right. Our brief exploration had revealed only part of the underground space, and the creature's ability to appear and disappear suggested they had access to areas we hadn't discovered. The cabin wasn't a refuge. It was a trap, designed to keep victims contained while the Pale Watchers completed their work. "We need to find out how they're getting in," Marcus said, checking his camera equipment with nervous energy. "If we can block their access, maybe we can hold them off until the storm passes completely." It was a slim hope, but it was better than simply waiting for whatever the creatures had planned. We gathered our lights and makeshift weapons and approached the hidden door behind the bookshelf. The lock was still secure, but that didn't mean the basement itself was empty. The key turned easily in the old lock, and the door swung open to reveal the narrow staircase descending into darkness. But now the darkness seemed alive, filled with subtle movements and the whisper of feet on stone. Our lights carved pale circles in the blackness, revealing glimpses of the basement we'd explored earlier, but now it felt different. Occupied, expectant, dangerous. "Hello," called a voice from the darkness below. It was a human voice, speaking clear English with a slight accent I couldn't place. But there was something wrong with it, something that suggested the vocal cords that produced it weren't quite the right shape or tension for human speech. "We know you're up there," the voice continued, patient and almost friendly. "We've been waiting for you. We have so much to show you." None of us responded, but our lights were probably answer enough. Footsteps echoed up from the basement, not the careful, stealthy movements we'd heard before, but the confident stride of someone approaching for a conversation. A figure emerged from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, and our lights revealed something that had once been human, but was no longer entirely so. It was male, middle-aged, wearing clothes that might have been fashionable 20 or 30 years ago. But his skin had the same translucent quality as the Pale Watchers, and his eyes reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's. "My name is David," he said, climbing the stairs slowly, his hands raised to show he carried no weapons. "I came here with my family in 1997. We were supposed to stay for a week, just like you." He paused halfway up the staircase, close enough that we could see the fine details of his transformation. His fingernails had grown into sharp curved points, and his teeth were too white and too numerous for a human mouth. "The Pale Ones, they don't just watch," David continued. "They preserve. They document everything about their subjects, and then they offer a choice. You can leave, try to escape back to your old lives with the knowledge of what you've seen here. Or you can stay and become part of something larger than yourself." "What happened to your family?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's expression shifted, and for a moment something genuinely human flickered in his transformed features. "My wife chose to leave. She made it as far as the main road before the Pale Ones brought her back. She's down here with us now, though it took her longer to adjust to the change." "And your children?" "The Pale Ones don't change children. They're too flexible, too adaptable. The children become something else entirely." The implications of his words sent ice through my veins. We weren't just facing creatures that wanted to observe and document us. We were dealing with things that collected people, that transformed them into servants or worse. "Why are you telling us this?" Jake demanded. David smiled, and his too numerous teeth gleamed in our flashlight beams. "Because you're going to join us eventually. Everyone does. The Pale Ones are very patient and they're very thorough, but the process is easier if you cooperate." "Go to hell," Emma spat. David's smile widened. "We tried that, actually. Turns out hell won't have us. The Pale Ones, they exist in the spaces between places, in the margins where reality gets thin. This forest, this cabin, it's one of those places. a crack in the world where impossible things become inevitable. He took another step up the stairs and I saw Jake grip his kitchen knife more tightly. But David made no threatening moves, instead spreading his arms in a gesture that might have been welcoming. "Come down and see," he offered. "Let us show you what you're going to become. The photographs are just the beginning. The pale ones preserve everything. Every memory, every experience, every moment of joy or terror or love. Nothing is lost. Nothing is forgotten." "No," I said firmly. "We're leaving. We're going to walk out of here right now." David chuckled, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "With what vehicles? You've seen the damage, and even if you could repair your cars, do you think the pale ones would simply let you drive away? They've invested too much in you already." "Then we'll walk. Through 40 miles of mountain wilderness with no supplies while being hunted by things that know these woods better than you know your own neighborhood?" David shook his head. "You're welcome to try, of course. The pale ones enjoy the chase. It makes for more interesting photographs." The conversation was surreal, terrifying in its casual tone and reasonable delivery. David spoke as if he was discussing vacation plans rather than our capture and transformation by otherworldly entities. But perhaps that was what he'd become, a thing that had once been human, but now served purposes we couldn't understand. "The storm's passing," Marcus observed, glancing toward the windows where gray daylight was growing slightly brighter. David nodded. "Yes, it should be clear by this afternoon. Perfect lighting for the final session. The pale ones prefer overcast skies for their work. The light is more even, fewer harsh shadows." "Final session?" Sarah asked. "The documentation of your transformation, of course. It's the most important part of the collection. The moment when you stop being what you were and become what you were always meant to be." Without warning, Jake lunged down the stairs, his knife raised and aimed at David's chest. But the transformed man moved with inhuman speed, stepping aside and allowing Jake to stumble past him into the darkness below. We heard the sound of impact, followed by Jake's voice crying out in pain and surprise. "Jake!" Emma screamed, starting down the stairs after him. "Don't!" I grabbed her arm, holding her back. "That's what they want. They want us to split up, to come down there on their territory." From the basement came the sound of multiple voices, David's reasonable tones mixed with others that spoke in languages I didn't recognize. Jake's responses were increasingly incoherent, and I realized with growing horror that they were doing something to him down there, beginning whatever process had transformed David and the others. "We have to help him," Emma sobbed, struggling against my grip. But even as she spoke, we could hear Jake's voice changing, becoming less recognizably human with each word. Whatever the pale ones did to their subjects, it worked quickly. "Jake," David called up from the darkness. "Tell your friends how it feels, help them understand." Jake's voice was dreamy, distant. "It's beautiful. I can see everything now, understand everything. The pale ones, they're not monsters. They're artists, collectors. They preserve beauty that would otherwise be lost." "Jake, fight it!" Emma screamed down the stairs, but the voice that answered no longer sounded like our friend. "There's nothing to fight. This is what I was meant to become, what we were all meant to become. Come down, Emma, let me show you." I slammed the basement door shut and turned the key, locking away whatever Jake had become. The sound of his transformation had been worse than any scream. The eager acceptance, the way his voice had changed not just in tone but in the fundamental patterns of human speech. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now, before they finish with him and come for the rest of us." "With what cars?" Marcus demanded. "You heard David. They've sabotaged everything." "Then we walk. 40 miles through the mountains is better than staying here and ending up like Jake." Emma was crying openly now, her sobs echoing through the cabin. Sarah wrapped her arms around the other woman, offering what comfort she could, but I could see the despair in both their faces. Jake had been the strongest of us, the most optimistic, the most likely to fight against impossible odds. If he could be transformed so quickly, what chance did the rest of us have? From behind the locked door came the sound of footsteps on the stairs, multiple sets, moving with purpose. They'd be testing the lock soon, and I had no confidence that it would hold against creatures that had demonstrated supernatural abilities. "Pack light," I ordered. "Just water and food we can carry. We leave in 10 minutes." But as we gathered supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were simply prolonging the inevitable. The Pale Ones had been collecting people for decades, had perfected their techniques through years of practice. They'd survived in these mountains for untold generations, adapting to every attempt at resistance or escape. Still, we had to try. The alternative was to wait passively for transformation, to join the collection of documented humanity that filled the basement below. I'd rather die in the forest than become another photographer in their otherworldly gallery. We slipped out the back door as quietly as possible, hoping to avoid the attention of the watchers we knew were stationed around the cabin. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with moisture and the smell of wet earth. Every footstep seemed impossibly loud, every breath visible in the cold mountain air. The forest that had seemed merely dense and unwelcoming upon our arrival now felt actively malevolent. The trees pressed close together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the gray daylight. Paths that had been clearly marked on our hiking maps were now invisible, overgrown with vegetation that seemed to shift and move when we weren't looking directly at it. We'd been walking for perhaps an hour when we heard the first sounds of pursuit. It started as a distant clicking, like dozens of camera shutters firing in sequence. The sound grew closer and more insistent, accompanied by the whisper of feet moving through underbrush and the occasional snap of branches being pushed aside by forms that moved without regard for the obstacles in their path. "They're following our trail," Marcus panted, glancing back over his shoulder at the forest we'd just traversed. "Those things, they know exactly where we've been." Of course they did. The Pale Ones had been hunting in these woods for decades, had learned every path and hiding place, every route that desperate victims might take in their attempts to escape. We were following patterns that had been established by countless others who had tried and failed to reach the safety of civilization. But what choice did we have? The alternative was to return to the cabin and submit to whatever transformation awaited us there. At least in the forest we had the illusion of freedom, the possibility that we might be the first to successfully escape their collection. The clicking sounds were getting closer, and now we could hear other noises mixed in with them. The scrape of unusual feet on stone, the rustle of fabric that didn't quite sound like any material I recognized, and occasionally something that might have been voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. "There!" Sarah pointed ahead to where the trees opened into a small clearing. "We can see them coming from there." It seemed like a reasonable strategy. Find open ground where we couldn't be surrounded, where we could at least see our attackers before they were upon us. But as we entered the clearing, I realized we'd made a mistake. The open space wasn't empty. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that shouldn't have existed. A camera the size of a small building, constructed of the same bone and metal materials we'd seen in the smaller devices the Pale Ones carried. It was ancient and obviously functional, its massive lens trained on the exact spot where we now stood. "It's a trap," Emma whispered. The realization came too late. As we turned to retreat back into the forest, the Pale Ones emerged from the trees around the clearing's perimeter. There were dozens of them, each carrying their twisted cameras, all focused on our small group huddled in the center of the open space. But these weren't the same creatures we'd seen watching the cabin. These Pale Ones were different, taller, thinner, with features that had been stretched and distorted beyond any recognizable form. Some moved on legs that bent in too many places. Others seemed to float inches above the ground, and a few had appendages that served the function of arms, but resembled nothing that had ever been human. And leading them, walking with the confident stride of someone returning home, was Jake. The transformation was complete. His skin had acquired the same translucent quality as the other creatures, and his proportions had been altered to match their alien geometry. But most disturbing of all was his expression, the eager anticipation of someone about to share wonderful news with dear friends. "You made it farther than most," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "The Pale Ones are impressed. They've been documenting your journey since you left the cabin." He raised the camera he now carried. a device that seemed to be part mechanical and part organic, with components that pulsed and shifted as he adjusted its settings. They want me to take the final photographs myself. They think it will be more meaningful if the images come from someone you trusted. Jake, please. Emma stepped toward him, her hands outstretched in supplication. You're still in there somewhere. I know you are. Fight this. Jake tilted his head, considering her words with the detached interest of a scientist observing an interesting specimen. I am fighting, he said finally. I'm fighting against the limitations I used to accept, the boundaries that kept me from seeing the truth. The Pale Ones don't destroy, they elevate. They transform potential into actualization. What happened to all the others? Sarah demanded. The people whose belongings we found in the basement? They're here. Jake gestured to the Pale Ones surrounding us. All of them. Preserved in their most essential form, contributing to something far greater than their individual existences could ever have achieved. The massive camera in the center of the clearing was beginning to hum, its components shifting and realigning as it prepared to capture whatever image the Pale Ones had planned. Other devices around the perimeter were activating as well, their lenses focusing on us with mechanical precision that suggested this ritual had been performed many times before. The transformation isn't painful, Jake continued, raising his camera and beginning to take pictures of our terror-stricken faces. It's actually quite beautiful. You'll retain your memories, your personalities, everything that makes you who you are, but you'll also gain so much more. The ability to see beyond the narrow spectrum of human perception, to understand truths that your current form can't comprehend. The clicking of camera shutters was growing louder as more Pale Ones began to document our final moments as humans. Each flash illuminated details I hadn't noticed before. The organic nature of their equipment, the way their bodies seemed to shift and flow between different configurations, the absolute patience with which they approached their work. Why? I asked, shouting to be heard over the mechanical symphony. What's the point of all this documentation? What do you do with the images? Jake paused in his photography, lowering his camera to consider the question. Memory, he said finally. The Pale Ones are memory made manifest. They preserve experiences that would otherwise be lost to time, moments of transformation and transcendence that mark the evolution of consciousness itself. You're insane, Marcus spat. All of you. This isn't preservation, it's collection. You're trophy hunters with delusions of artistic grandeur. Jake's expression shifted, and for a moment I saw something of our old friend in his transformed features. Disappointment, perhaps even hurt. You'll understand when it happens to you, he said sadly. The perspective changes everything. What seems like horror from your limited viewpoint is actually profound beauty. The massive camera was ready now, its lens aperture opening to reveal depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical dimensions of the device. Looking into it was like staring into a tunnel that led to somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark and patient and hungry for new experiences to catalog and preserve. Last chance, Jake said, raising his camera again. You can cooperate, make the transition willingly, or we can proceed with the standard method. Either way, the outcome is the same. I looked at my remaining companions, Sarah, Marcus, and Emma, and saw my own desperate determination reflected in their faces. We'd come too far and seen too much to simply submit to this otherworldly collection. If we were going to be transformed, we'd at least try to go down fighting. Together, I said quietly. We rushed them as one, our improvised weapons raised and our voices lifted in defiant screams that echoed through the forest clearing. The Pale Ones didn't seem particularly concerned by our charge. They simply adjusted their cameras and continued documenting as we ran toward certain destruction. But something unexpected happened as we crossed the center of the clearing. The massive camera, which had been focusing its otherworldly attention on our group, suddenly shifted its aim. Instead of capturing our transformation, it turned toward the Pale Ones themselves and began to emit a sound like breaking glass amplified through a cathedral organ. The effect on our captors was immediate and dramatic. They dropped their cameras and began to writhe in apparent agony, their forms becoming even more distorted as they struggled against some invisible force. Jake fell to his knees, his transformed features contorting as he screamed in languages that predated human speech. "What's happening?" Sarah gasped, stopping our charge as the pale ones collapsed around us. Marcus was staring at the massive camera with growing understanding. "It's not theirs," he said. "Look at the construction. It's different from their equipment. Older. This is something else entirely." He was right. Now that I looked more closely, the giant camera showed signs of different craftsmanship. Where the pale one's devices were organic and flowing, this machine was angular and precise, built with a geometric perfection that suggested mathematical rather than biological origins. And from somewhere within its impossible depths came a voice that resonated through our bones rather than our ears. "You do not belong here." The pale ones were retreating now, carrying their fallen comrades back into the forest with the urgent haste of creatures that had suddenly found themselves outmatched. Jake cast one last look in our direction, his transformed features showing confusion and something that might have been fear, before he too disappeared into the trees. "The camera's protecting us," Emma said wonderingly. "But why?" As if in response to her question, the massive device began to emit images, not photographs in any conventional sense, but projections that appeared in the air around us like three-dimensional holograms. They showed the history of this place, the true history that predated the Pale One's arrival by centuries. We saw the forest as it had been originally, not empty wilderness, but home to something far older and more powerful than the creatures that now hunted here. The images showed beings of light and geometry, entities that existed in perfect mathematical harmony with the natural world around them. They had built the giant camera not as a tool of capture, but as a guardian, a sentinel designed to protect the sanctity of this place from intrusion. The Pale Ones had been intruders, refugees from some other dimension who had sought to claim this forest as their own hunting ground. For decades, they had managed to avoid the Guardian's attention by limiting their activities and keeping their presence small. But our arrival had somehow triggered a response, awakened the ancient protector to the contamination that had taken root in its domain. "We need to leave," I said, as the visions faded and the Guardian camera turned its attention back toward the forest where the Pale Ones had retreated. "This isn't our fight, and we don't belong here any more than they do." But as we prepared to continue our escape, we heard something that stopped us cold. Human voices calling from somewhere deeper in the woods. Not the transformed speech of the Pale One's victims, but genuine human conversation, urgent and frightened. "There are others," Marcus said. "Other people like us." The ethical dilemma was immediate and clear. We could continue our own escape, use the Guardian's intervention to reach safety and never look back. Or we could try to help the other victims, knowing that doing so would mean staying in this nightmarish forest longer and risking our own capture if the Pale Ones regrouped. "We have to try," Sarah said quietly. "If there are people out there who might still be saved." Emma nodded reluctantly. Jake would have wanted us to try. The mention of our transformed friend sent a stab of pain through my chest, but it also crystallized our decision. We couldn't save Jake. He was too far gone, too changed to ever return to his original form. But if there were others who hadn't yet been transformed, we had an obligation to at least attempt their rescue. The voices were coming from the direction of what appeared to be another clearing, deeper in the forest but still within the protective range of the Guardian camera. We made our way carefully through the underbrush, following the sounds of human distress while staying alert for any sign that the Pale Ones had regrouped and resumed their hunt. What we found in the second clearing was both heartening and deeply disturbing. 3 people, a family consisting of 2 adults and a teenage girl, were huddled together in the center of the open space, surrounded by a circle of abandoned Pale One cameras. The devices were obviously functional, but had been left behind when their operators fled, suggesting that this had been another capture site that the Guardian's intervention had disrupted. "Are you real?" the man called out when he saw us approaching. "Not more of those things?" "We're real," I assured him. "We're trying to get out of here, same as you." The family's story was depressingly familiar. They'd rented the cabin for a weekend getaway, had been stalked and terrorized by the Pale Ones, and had attempted to escape when it became clear that they were trapped. But unlike us, they'd been caught in the open when the creatures decided to begin their final documentation session. "They were about to do something to us," the woman explained, her voice shaking with residual terror. "Those cameras, they started making this sound, and I could feel something changing inside me, like my thoughts were being pulled out of my head." The teenage girl, who couldn't have been more than 16, was staring at the abandoned cameras with an expression of fascination that worried me. "They showed me things," she said quietly, "while they were taking pictures. Beautiful things. Impossible things. I think I understand what they were trying to do." "Don't," her father said sharply. "Don't try to understand them. That's how they get inside your head." But I could see in the girl's eyes the same look that had been in Jake's face during his transformation, the eager anticipation of someone on the verge of a profound revelation. The Pale One's process wasn't just physical, it was psychological, seductive, designed to make its victims want to cooperate with their own metamorphosis. "We need to get out of here," I said urgently. "All of us, right now, before they regroup." The family was in worse shape than we were. They'd been running through the forest for days, had little food or water left, and were clearly on the edge of physical and emotional collapse. But they were still human, still savable, and that gave us hope that our own escape might actually be possible. As we prepared to leave the clearing, the abandoned cameras began to activate on their own. Their lenses turned to follow our movements, and the clicking of shutters resumed as they documented our presence. But these images felt different, less predatory, more like the work of security cameras recording evidence. The Guardian, Marcus realized. It's using their own equipment against them, creating a record of what really happens here. The implications were staggering. If the Guardian was indeed documenting the Pale One's activities, preserving evidence of their predations, then perhaps other authorities, human or otherwise, might eventually intervene. Perhaps we weren't as alone as we'd believed, but that was a hope for the future. Our immediate concern was survival, and as we led the exhausted family deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that our rescue mission had only delayed the inevitable. The Pale Ones were still out there, still hunting, and the Guardian's protection might not extend beyond its immediate vicinity. The journey toward civilization was a nightmare of exhaustion, paranoia, and constant vigilance. Every shadow might conceal a Pale One. Every sound might herald the resumption of the hunt. The family we'd rescued slowed our progress considerably, but abandoning them was unthinkable. They represented proof that escape was possible, evidence that the Pale Ones weren't invincible. It was the teenage girl who first spotted the road. After what felt like days of stumbling through endless forest, she pointed ahead to where a strip of asphalt was barely visible through the trees. It was a real road with painted lines and reflective markers, and the most beautiful sight I'd ever encountered. But as we approached the blessed ribbon of civilization, we discovered we weren't alone. A familiar figure stood at the forest's edge, his transformed features sad but determined as he watched our approach. Jake was waiting for us. "You can't leave," he said as we emerged from the tree line. "Not with what you've seen, what you know. The Pale Ones can't allow that level of exposure to the outside world." "Watch us," Emma snarled, though I could see the tears streaming down her face at the sight of what her boyfriend had become. Jake's expression softened, and for a moment something genuinely human flickered in his transformed features. "I'm sorry, Em. I really am. But this is bigger than just us. Bigger than what we want or fear. The Pale Ones aren't the only things living in the margins of reality. If word gets out about this place, it will attract attention from entities that make our current situation look like a minor inconvenience." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that some secrets are too dangerous to share. Some knowledge is too toxic for the unprepared mind to process. You've seen what happens to people who learn too much about the spaces between worlds." As he spoke, more figures emerged from the forest behind him. Not Pale Ones, but other transformed humans. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all watching us with the same patient determination that characterized their inhuman masters. Everyone who's ever been to the cabin, I realized. You're all still here. Jake nodded. Still here, still serving our purpose, still preserving the boundary between what is and what shouldn't be allowed to become. The Pale Ones aren't conquerors, they're guardians, protectors of a reality that most humans aren't equipped to handle. That's insane, Marcus protested. You're talking about cosmic horror movie nonsense. Am I? Jake gestured toward the forest behind us where strange lights were beginning to flicker among the trees. You've seen the Guardian camera, experienced its projections. You know there are forces at work here that don't fit into any human understanding of how the world operates. The Pale Ones are just one small part of a much larger ecosystem of impossible things. The lights in the forest were growing brighter, and I could hear sounds that definitely didn't belong to any earthly environment. Musical tones that seemed to exist in dimensions that human ears weren't designed to process. Mechanical rhythms that suggested machinery, built according to non-Euclidean principles. The Guardian is waking up completely, Jake continued. Your presence here, your resistance to the Pale One's collection has triggered responses that haven't been active for centuries. If you leave now, if you bring investigators or researchers or anyone else who might want to study this place, you'll be opening a door that can never be closed again. So what's the alternative? Sarah demanded. Stay here and become monsters like you? Stay here and become protectors, Jake corrected. Sentinels who ensure that the boundaries remain intact, that the spaces between worlds don't bleed through into places where they could cause real damage. The philosophical debate might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of something that made all previous encounters seem trivial by comparison. The lights in the forest suddenly blazed with intensity that turned night into artificial day, and from the depths of the woods came a sound like the universe itself clearing its throat. The Guardian had awakened fully. What emerged from the tree line wasn't a camera or any other recognizable device, but a geometric form that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could properly process. It moved with purpose that transcended mere mechanical function, examining our small group with attention that felt simultaneously infinite and utterly personal. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through our bones and minds rather than our ears. The contamination spreads, the breach widens, the choice approaches. Jake stepped forward, his transformed features showing what might have been fear or reverence. Guardian, we seek to contain the exposure, to maintain the boundary as we have for decades. The boundary fails. The old methods prove insufficient. New measures become necessary. The entity turned its attention to our group, and I felt my mind being examined with thoroughness that made the Pale One's photography seem superficial by comparison. Every memory, every thought, every secret fear and hidden desire was catalogued and analyzed in an instant that lasted forever. These ones have seen too much, the Guardian concluded. They have witnessed the spaces between. They cannot return unchanged to the world that believes itself singular and whole. What does that mean? The teenage girl asked, her voice small but unafraid. The Guardian's response came not in words but in visions that flooded our minds with images of possibilities and consequences. We saw what would happen if knowledge of this place reached the outside world. Not just government investigators or scientific researchers, but worse things. Entities from other dimensions that fed on human curiosity, parasites that used openings in reality to invade and corrupt, forces that viewed our world as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be harvested. But we also saw the alternative, transformation not into the Pale One's servants, but into something else entirely. Guardians ourselves, equipped with the knowledge and abilities necessary to protect both worlds from contamination by the other. You offer us the same choice the Pale Ones did, I said. Transform or die. Not the same, the Guardian replied. The Pale Ones collect. I preserve. The Pale Ones serve themselves. I serve continuity. And if we refuse? The visions that answered that question were too horrible to process fully. Not our deaths, but something far worse. Existence as conscious observers trapped within the Guardian's memory banks, aware but powerless, watching endless cycles of cosmic horror unfold, while being unable to affect or escape them. It wasn't really a choice at all. "How long do we have to decide?" Sarah asked. "The decision has already been made. The transformation begins when you acknowledge its necessity." And the terrible truth was that it was necessary. We'd learned too much, seen too much, crossed too many lines that separated the normal world from the impossible one that existed in its margins. There was no going back to our old lives, no pretending that we hadn't witnessed the spaces between reality where ancient things waited with inhuman patience. The family we'd rescued was facing the same realization, their expressions cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance. The teenage girl was the first to step forward, her young mind apparently more adaptable to cosmic impossibilities than adult consciousness. "Will it hurt?" she asked. "Transformation is never painless," the guardian admitted. "But the pain serves a purpose. It marks the boundary between what you were and what you become. One by one, we approach the geometric entity that would remake us into something capable of protecting both worlds from contamination by the other." The process was indeed painful, not just physically but existentially, as fundamental aspects of human consciousness were altered to accommodate knowledge that mortal minds weren't designed to contain. But Jake had been right about one thing. We retained ourselves, our personalities and memories and relationships, even as we gained abilities and perspectives that transcended human limitations. The love I felt for Sarah remained unchanged, though it was now accompanied by understanding of how such emotions functioned across dimensional boundaries. The friendship I'd shared with Jake was restored, though it now existed within a framework of cosmic responsibility that put our personal concerns into perspective. The transformation completed, we took our places among the other guardians who protected this breach point between worlds. The pale ones were still there, still collecting and documenting, but now we understood their true purpose. They were antibodies in a cosmic immune system, preserving and studying contamination to prevent its spread. The cabin still stands in the forest, still rents to unsuspecting visitors who seek escape from the complications of modern life. Some leave unchanged, their minds too limited or too focused on mundane concerns to notice the impossible things that watch from the shadows. Others join our ranks, their consciousness expanded to accommodate truths that most humans spend their entire lives avoiding. We are the guardians now, the protectors of boundaries that most people never realize exist. We watch, we document, we preserve the delicate balance that keeps both worlds safe from contamination by the other. It's not the life we planned, not the future we thought we wanted, but it's necessary work. And there's satisfaction in knowing that our transformation serves a purpose larger than ourselves. Sometimes, in quiet moments between duties, I wonder what would have happened if we'd chosen differently. If we'd fought harder, run faster, somehow found a way back to our old lives and the illusion of safety they provided. But such speculation is pointless now. We are what we needed to become, shaped by necessity into forms capable of protecting what needs protection. The camera shutters still click in the darkness, documenting moments of transformation and transcendence that mark the evolution of consciousness itself. But now we understand that the photographs aren't trophies or souvenirs. They're evidence, proof that the boundaries between worlds remain intact, that the impossible things stay where they belong. And if you're reading this account, if you've somehow stumbled across this record of our transformation, then perhaps you're ready to understand why some stories are too dangerous to share, why some truths are too toxic for the unprepared mind to process. The spaces between worlds are vast and patient, filled with entities that view our reality as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be harvested. But they're also protected by guardians who were once human, who remember what it means to love and fear and hope, who use that remembered humanity to preserve the boundaries that keep both worlds safe from contamination by the other. We are still here, still watching, still serving our purpose. And if you ever find yourself driving through the mountains of upstate New York, if you see a rental listing that seems too good to be true for a secluded cabin in the woods, remember this story and choose carefully. Some vacations change you forever. Some prices are too high to pay, no matter how appealing the destination might seem. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The watchers in the forest are patient, and they are always recruiting. If this true story of terror in the wilderness resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more accounts of the impossible things that exist in the margins of our reality. Share your own encounters in the comments below, but be warned that some experiences are too dangerous to discuss in detail. The boundaries between worlds are more fragile than most people realize, and knowledge itself can become a form of contamination that spreads beyond any individual's ability to control. Subscribe now, and remember that some truths are preserved not for entertainment but as warnings for those wise enough to heed them. Evening, as we'd planned, gathered around the fireplace with drinks and snacks, playing cards and sharing stories and pretending that everything was exactly as it should be. Jake built a roaring fire using wood from a stack beside the hearth, and the crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the walls that made the mounted animal heads seem to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The warmth was welcome. The mountain air had turned cold quickly after sunset, and the cabin's heating system seemed to consist primarily of the fireplace and hope. Emma, who had been quiet since our arrival, finally began to relax as the alcohol worked its social magic. She curled up against Jake on the worn leather sofa and actually smiled when Marcus regaled us with increasingly ridiculous stories from his various photography assignments. Even I started to feel foolish for my earlier apprehension. This was what we'd come for. Good friends, good drinks, and freedom from the constant connectivity that had turned our lives into an endless stream of notifications and obligations. It was nearly midnight when we heard the first sound from outside. The conversation died instantly, 5 pairs of eyes turning toward the front windows as a low, mournful howl drifted through the glass. It was definitely an animal. Wolf, coyote, maybe a large dog. But there was something almost human in its tone. A quality of longing or distress that made the hair on my arm stand up. "Just a wolf," Jake said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Probably caught a scent from our food." The howl came again, closer this time, and was answered by another from a different direction. Then another. Within moments, the silence was broken by a chorus of voices calling to each other across the darkness, their cries weaving together into a sound that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. "How many of them do you think there are?" Emma whispered, her earlier relaxation evaporating as she pressed closer to Jake. Marcus had moved to the front window, his camera forgotten as he tried to peer into the black forest beyond. "I can't see anything. The trees are too thick." He turned back to the group, his expression troubled. "But they sound like they're all around us." The howling continued for perhaps 10 minutes, sometimes growing louder as if the pack was moving closer to the cabin, other times fading as they ranged further into the woods. But even when the individual calls stopped, we could hear other sounds, branches breaking, leaves rustling, and occasionally something that might have been footsteps circling the building. "Maybe we should make sure all the doors are locked," Sarah suggested, her practical nature asserting itself despite the strangeness of the situation. I remembered Harold's parting words and nodded. "Good idea. I'll check the back door." The rear of the cabin opened onto a small porch that overlooked a clearing where the previous owners had apparently attempted to maintain a garden. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting everything in silver and black, and I could see the dark line where the forest resumed, perhaps 50 yards from the house. The door was already locked, its deadbolt thrown, but as I tested the handle, movement in the clearing caught my eye. At first I thought it was just the shadows of branches swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. But as I watched, the movement resolved into shapes, large, dark forms moving with purpose across the open space. They were too far away, and the light too dim for me to make out details. But they moved wrong somehow, with a gait that was neither fully animal nor human. One of the shapes paused at the edge of the clearing and seemed to turn toward the cabin. For a moment that stretched into eternity, I had the absolute certainty that it was looking directly at me through the glass door, though I couldn't make out any features in the darkness. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest with the others, leaving me to wonder if I'd seen anything at all. "Everything okay back here?" Marcus appeared beside me, his camera now hanging around his neck. "Yeah," I said, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. "Just checking the lock." He peered out into the clearing, his photographer's eye searching for details in the low light. "Did you see something out there?" I hesitated. What had I seen exactly? Shadows that moved strangely? Shapes that could have been anything from deer to fallen branches? I'm not sure. Maybe some animals moving through. Marcus raised his camera and adjusted the settings, then fired off several shots with the flash. The brilliant white light strobed across the clearing, momentarily illuminating every detail in stark black and white. Trees, grass, an old wooden fence post, and nothing else. No animals, no moving shadows, no sign that anything had been there at all. "Probably just your imagination," he said kindly, lowering the camera. "This place would make anyone jumpy. All those horror movies, you know? Our brains are wired to see threats in the dark." I nodded and forced a smile. But as we returned to the main room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The others had settled back into their earlier positions around the fire, but the mood had shifted. The howling had stopped, but its absence felt more ominous than the sound itself had been. We finished our drinks in relative quiet, making occasional attempts at conversation that died out before they could gain momentum. By 1 in the morning, we'd all agreed it was time for bed. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the chill was beginning to seep through the cabin's walls despite the lingering warmth from the hearth. Jake and Emma disappeared upstairs, their footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors above us. Marcus retired to his room at the front of the house, leaving Sarah and me to make our way to the back bedroom. As I brushed my teeth in the small bathroom adjacent to our room, I found myself listening intently to the sounds of the old building settling around us. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through the eaves, every small noise seemed amplified in the mountain silence. Sarah was already in bed when I emerged, curled under the thick quilts and staring out the window at the dark forest beyond. "I keep thinking I see movement out there," she murmured as I slid in beside her. "But every time I look directly, there's nothing." I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close for warmth and comfort. "It's just shadows, the moonlight playing tricks." But I'd been seeing it too. Fleeting impressions of motion just at the edge of perception, shapes that seemed to dart between the trees whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. It was probably nothing more than tired eyes and an overactive imagination, but that didn't make it any less unnerving. We lay in the darkness for a long time, listening to the old cabin creak and settle around us. Eventually, Sarah's breathing deepened and evened out, and I thought I might finally be able to sleep as well. The exhaustion from the long drive was catching up with me, and the alcohol was helping to blur the edges of my anxiety. I was just beginning to drift off when I heard the scratching. It was soft at first, so faint that I almost convinced myself it was just another settling noise or perhaps a branch brushing against the cabin's exterior. But as I lay there in the darkness, it became clear that this was something else entirely. Something was scratching at the wall just outside our window. Long, deliberate scraping sounds like claws or fingernails dragging across wood. My eyes snapped open, and I found myself staring at the window, where the curtains were drawn but still allowed a faint amount of moonlight to filter through. The scratching continued, moving along the wall from left to right, as if whatever was making the sound was walking alongside the cabin's exterior. Sarah stirred beside me but didn't wake. I debated whether to rouse her, but what would be the point? If there was actually something outside, there was nothing we could do about it from inside a locked cabin. And if it was just my imagination, waking her would only spread the paranoia. The scratching stopped directly outside our window. For several long minutes, there was absolute silence. Not even the normal sounds of wind in the trees or the building's natural settling. Just perfect, expectant quiet that seemed to press in around me like a physical thing. I held my breath, straining to hear any indication of what might be outside, but the silence stretched on until I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I heard breathing. It was slow and deliberate, the measured rhythm of something large trying to be quiet. Each exhale was clearly audible, a soft sighing that seemed to fog the glass just inches from where I lay. Whatever was out there was standing directly outside our window, so close that if not for the wall and glass between us, I could have reached out and touched it. I wanted to move, to get up and look, to do something other than lie there frozen with an unnamed terror that seemed to seep into my bones like cold water. But every instinct screamed at me to remain still, to not draw attention to myself, to pretend I was asleep and hope that whatever was outside would move on. The breathing continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, muscles cramped from holding the same position, until I heard the faint sound of movement retreating into the forest. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally again. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to every small sound, watching the curtained window for any sign of shadows moving beyond the glass, and trying to convince myself that I'd experienced nothing more than a vivid anxiety dream. By the time pale morning light began to filter through the curtains, I'd almost succeeded in talking myself out of the reality of what I'd heard. Almost. Sarah woke with the sun, stretching and yawning, and commenting on how well she'd slept despite the unfamiliar surroundings. I didn't mention the scratching or the breathing, partly because I was no longer entirely sure it had been real, and partly because I didn't want to cast a shadow over what was supposed to be our relaxing getaway. Instead, I made coffee in the cabin's surprisingly well-equipped kitchen while she showered, and tried to shake off the lingering unease that clung to me like smoke. The others emerged gradually, drawn by the smell of coffee and the promise of breakfast. Jake was his usual cheerful morning self, already planning the day's activities, a hike to a nearby waterfall, maybe some fishing in the stream that ran through the property, definitely more time around the fire pit that evening. Emma seemed more rested than she'd been since our arrival, and even Marcus appeared relaxed as he showed us the photos he'd taken the night before. It was while scrolling through the images on his camera's LCD screen that he paused, frowning at one particular shot. "That's weird," he murmured, zooming in on a section of the photo. "I don't remember seeing this when I took the picture." He handed me the camera, and I found myself looking at one of the shots he'd taken through the back door the night before. The flash had illuminated the clearing in stark detail, showing grass and trees and the old fence post I remembered. But there, barely visible at the very edge of the frame where the forest began, was something else. It might have been a tree trunk or a large rock, but the shape was wrong. Too upright, too narrow, too much like a figure standing just beyond the reach of the camera's flash. And at the top of the shape, barely discernible in the grainy darkness, were two pale spots that could have been eyes reflecting the camera's light. "Probably just a tree or something," Marcus said, taking the camera back and studying the image more closely. "The angle and the lighting make it look weird, but it's got to be something natural." I wanted to agree with him, but looking at that photo sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The shape was too purposeful, too positioned, too much like something that had been watching us from the darkness while we congratulated ourselves on our clever detection of nothing at all. The first full day of our vacation proceeded according to plan, at least on the surface. We hiked to the waterfall Jake had found on a trail map, a beautiful cascade that tumbled down a series of rocky steps into a clear pool surrounded by autumn foliage. The exercise and fresh air helped clear my head, and by afternoon I'd almost convinced myself that the previous night's experiences had been nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination adjusting to an unfamiliar environment. Marcus documented everything with his usual enthusiasm, capturing images of the waterfall, the forest, and our group enjoying our wilderness adventure. Emma actually seemed to be enjoying herself, collecting interesting rocks and pointing out birds that I couldn't have identified if my life depended on it. Sarah was in her element, having traded her usual business attire for hiking boots and a flannel shirt that made her look like she'd stepped out of an REI catalog. It was only when we returned to the cabin in the late afternoon that the unease began to creep back in. The first sign that something was wrong came from Jake, who'd gone around to the back of the cabin to check on the generator that powered the building's electrical systems. He called for the rest of us to come look, his voice carrying an odd note that made us all stop what we were doing. "Does this look normal to you guys?" he asked when we'd gathered around the small utility shed that housed the generator. The metal door of the shed was scratched, not just a few random marks, but deep gouges that ran in parallel lines as if something with very large claws had been trying to get inside. The scratches were fresh, cutting through the paint and rust down to bare metal that gleamed silver in the afternoon sun. "Maybe a bear?" Emma suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "They can smell food sometimes, right? Maybe it thought there was something to eat in there." Marcus was already taking pictures, his camera clicking as he documented the damage from various angles. "These are pretty deep," he observed, running his finger along one of the gouges. Whatever did this was either really determined or really strong, probably both. I knelt beside the shed and examined the marks more closely. They were indeed deep, cutting through metal that would have resisted anything short of industrial tools. But more disturbing than their depth was their pattern. 3 parallel lines repeated in several locations, as if something with 3 clawed hands had scraped at the door multiple times. "We should probably report this to Harold," Sarah said practically. "He'll want to know if there's been damage to his property." The thought of contacting our absent landlord reminded me that we were completely cut off from the outside world. No cell service, no landline, no way to reach anyone beyond the boundaries of this isolated property. If something happened, if someone got hurt or we needed help, we would be entirely on our own until we could make the long drive back to civilization. That realization should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like a trap closing around us. We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the immediate area around the cabin, partly out of curiosity and partly, I think, because none of us wanted to acknowledge how unsettling the scratched generator shed had been. The property was larger than I'd initially realized, encompassing not just the cabin and its immediate clearing, but also a substantial section of forest that stretched back into the mountains. An overgrown trail led from behind the house toward what appeared to be the ruins of some older structure. Stone foundations and a few weathered wooden posts that might once have supported a barn or workshop. "This place has been here a long time," Marcus observed, photographing the ruins from multiple angles. "These stones are old, hand-cut, not machine-made. Somebody put a lot of work into this place back in the day." The ruins felt different from the rest of the property, somehow more oppressive despite being open to the sky. Weeds and small trees had grown up through the stone foundation, but I could still make out the outline of rooms and doorways. In what might once have been the center of the structure, a circle of blackened stone suggested a fireplace, or perhaps something else entirely. "Look at this," Emma called from the far side of the ruins. She was standing beside what appeared to be a well, though the wooden cover had long since rotted away, leaving only an open hole in the ground surrounded by a low stone wall. We gathered around the opening and peered down into darkness that our flashlight beams couldn't penetrate. The well was deep, so deep that when Jake dropped a stone into it, we never heard it hit bottom. The smell that rose from the depths was organic and unpleasant, like compost that had gone bad or meat left too long in the sun. "Probably just stagnant water," Sarah said, stepping back from the edge. "Wells like this can develop all kinds of nasty bacteria." But even as she spoke, I could see in her expression the same unease that was growing in all of us. This wasn't just an old well. There was something fundamentally wrong about it. Something that made every primitive survival instinct scream warnings about standing too close to the edge. We made our way back to the cabin as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the forest that seemed to reach for us with dark fingers. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and clouds were moving in from the west, promising weather that would make the night even darker than it had been before. Dinner was a subdued affair. Jake made an effort to maintain the festive atmosphere we'd started with, but his jokes fell flat, and his usual enthusiasm seemed forced. Emma had retreated into herself, picking at her food and staring out the windows at the gathering darkness. Marcus was obsessively reviewing his photographs, scrolling through image after image, with a focused intensity that suggested he was looking for something specific. "Find anything interesting?" I asked, settling beside him on the couch after we'd finished eating. He shook his head but didn't look up from the camera's LCD screen. "Just checking the shots from today, making sure I didn't miss anything." He paused on one image, a photo of the forest taken from the trail during our afternoon hike. "It's probably nothing, but look at this." The photo showed a typical section of woodland, trees, and undergrowth dappled with afternoon sunlight. But there, Barely visible among the shadows between two large pines, was a pale vertical shape that didn't quite look like part of the natural landscape. "Could be another tree," Marcus said, but his voice suggested he didn't believe it. "The lighting makes it hard to tell." I studied the image more closely. The shape was too uniform, too smooth to be a tree trunk, and at its top, just at the limit of the camera's resolution, were two dark spots that could have been anything but looked disturbingly like eyes. "Were you aware of anyone else in the area when you took this?" I asked. "That's just it. There was nobody. We were completely alone out there." Marcus zoomed in as far as the camera would allow, but the increased magnification only made the image grainier without revealing any additional details. "I've been through all the photos from today, and this is the only one that shows anything like this." Sarah joined us, looking over my shoulder at the camera's screen. "What am I looking at?" I pointed to the pale shape among the trees. "Marcus thinks he might have caught someone else in the forest today." She frowned, studying the image. "It doesn't really look like a person, though. The proportions are all wrong. Too tall, too thin." She was right. The more I looked at it, the less the shape resembled anything human. It was easily 7 feet tall and impossibly narrow, like a stretched reflection of a person rather than an actual figure. But if it wasn't human, what was it? And why did the thought of it standing in the forest watching us while we hiked obliviously past make my skin crawl? The wind picked up as full darkness settled over the mountains, rattling the cabin's windows and sending tree branches scraping against the roof. The sound of the forest had changed from the previous night's profound silence to a symphony of creaks and groans and rustling that made it impossible to distinguish between natural sounds and potential threats. Jake built another fire, and we settled around it as we had the night before, but the easy camaraderie was gone. We were all listening now, all watching the dark windows for signs of movement beyond the glass. Even Jake seemed subdued, his usual stream of conversation reduced to occasional observations about the weather or suggestions for the next day's activities. It was Emma who first voiced what we were all thinking. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" she asked quietly, her arms wrapped around her knees as she stared into the fire. The question hung in the air for a long moment before Marcus nodded. "I've felt it since yesterday, like there's something out there just beyond where we can see." "The local wildlife, probably," Jake suggested, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We're in their territory, after all. It makes sense that they'd be curious about us." "This doesn't feel like curiosity," Sarah said. "This feels like hunting." The word sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cabin's walls. Hunting implied intention, intelligence, purpose, qualities that suggested whatever was out there was more than just curious wildlife. As if summoned by our conversation, a sound drifted through the walls from somewhere outside. It wasn't the howling we'd heard the previous night, but something else entirely. A rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It came from the direction of the front porch, measured and deliberate, and continued for perhaps 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. We sat frozen, listening to the silence that followed. Then the tapping resumed, this time from a different location, the side of the cabin where our bedroom was located. The sound moved along the wall, each tap distinct and purposeful, as if something was testing the cabin's exterior, looking for weaknesses or ways inside. "Should we look?" Marcus whispered, his camera clutched in his hands. Before anyone could answer, the tapping stopped. For several minutes we waited in tense silence, but the sound didn't resume. Whatever had been circling the cabin had either moved on or was now standing still, waiting for us to make the next move. Jake was the first to break the spell, standing up and moving toward the front window. "I'm going to see if there's anything out there." "Don't," Emma said sharply. "Just leave it alone." But Jake was already pulling aside the curtain and peering out into the darkness beyond the porch. For a moment he stood silently, his face pressed close to the glass. Then he jerked backward as if he'd been burned, his face pale in the firelight. "What is it?" Sarah demanded. "What did you see?" Jake's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. There's someone out there standing at the edge of the trees just watching the house. We all rushed to the window, crowding around Jake as he pointed toward the forest. At first I couldn't see anything but darkness and the vague shapes of trees silhouetted against the cloudy sky. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw what had startled him. There was indeed a figure standing at the tree line, perhaps 50 yards from the cabin. It was tall and impossibly thin, its pale form clearly visible against the dark forest behind it. But there was something wrong with its proportions. Its arms hung too low, nearly reaching the ground, and its head seemed too small for its elongated body. "That's not human," Emma breathed, her voice barely audible. As if it had heard her words, the figure began to move. But instead of walking, it seemed to glide, its feet never touching the ground as it circled around the cabin's perimeter. We followed its progress from window to window, watching in horrified fascination as it completed a full circuit of the building before returning to its original position at the forest's edge. Then it was joined by another figure, and another. Within minutes, there were at least a dozen of the pale forms standing among the trees, all facing the cabin, all perfectly still. They were too far away and the light too dim to make out any details, but their very presence radiated malevolence that seemed to seep through the walls and fill the cabin with dread. "We need to call for help," Emma said, her voice rising toward panic. "With what?" Jake replied. "There's no cell service, no landline, we're completely cut off." "Then we need to leave. Get in the cars and drive back to town." Marcus was already shaking his head. "In the dark? On those mountain roads? We barely made it up here in daylight. And what if they follow us?" The figures remained motionless, watching, waiting. There had to be more than 20 of them now, arranged in a loose semicircle that blocked any direct path to our vehicles. Even if we could reach the cars, the narrow driveway would force us to drive directly toward them. "What do they want?" Sarah whispered. It was a question none of us could answer, but as we stood there staring out at our watchers, I couldn't shake the feeling that we already knew. They wanted us, not just our attention or our fear, but us, and they were willing to wait as long as necessary to get what they came for. The standoff continued through the night. We took turns keeping watch while the others tried to rest, though none of us managed more than brief periods of uneasy sleep. The figures never moved from their positions, never showed any sign of fatigue or impatience. They simply stood there in the darkness, watching the cabin with an intensity that seemed to pierce through walls and glass and penetrate our very souls. By morning, they were gone. The forest that had been filled with pale, waiting forms now showed no sign that anything unusual had happened. Birds sang in the trees, squirrels chattered from branch to branch, and the early sun painted everything in warm golden tones that made the previous night's terror seem like a shared nightmare. "Maybe we should pack up and head home," Emma suggested over breakfast, her voice hoarse from a night of whispered conversations and suppressed fear. Jake shook his head. "We paid for the full week. And besides, what are we going to tell people back home? That we ran away because we saw some weird shapes in the forest?" "They weren't shapes," Marcus said quietly. "They were something else. Something that doesn't belong in any nature documentary I've ever seen." "Which is exactly why no one would believe us," Jake replied. "Look, I'm not saying last night wasn't scary, but it's daylight now, and they're gone. Maybe they were just curious about us, and now that curiosity is satisfied." But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Jake had always been the optimist of our group, the one who found silver linings and bright sides even in the worst situations. The fact that he was trying so hard to rationalize what we'd seen only emphasized how deeply it had shaken all of us. The transformation completed, we took our places among the other guardians who protected this breach point between worlds. The pale ones were still there, still collecting and documenting, but now we understood their true purpose. They were antibodies in a cosmic immune system, preserving and studying contamination to prevent its spread. The cabin still stands in the forest, still rents to unsuspecting visitors who seek escape from the complications of modern life. Some leave unchanged, their minds too limited or too focused on mundane concerns to notice the impossible things that watch from the shadows. Others join our ranks, their consciousness expanded to accommodate truths that most humans spend their entire lives avoiding. We are the guardians now, the protectors of boundaries that most people never realize exist. We watch, we document, we preserve the delicate balance that keeps both worlds safe from contamination by the other. It's not the life we planned, not the future we thought we wanted, but it's necessary work. And there's satisfaction in knowing that our transformation serves a purpose larger than ourselves. Sometimes, in quiet moments between duties, I wonder what would have happened if we'd chosen differently. If we'd fought harder, run faster, somehow found a way back to our old lives and the illusion of safety they provided. But such speculation is pointless now. We are what we needed to become, shaped by necessity into forms capable of protecting what needs protection. The camera shutters still click in the darkness, documenting moments of transformation and transcendence that mark the evolution of consciousness itself. But now we understand that the photographs aren't trophies or souvenirs. They're evidence, proof that the boundaries between worlds remain intact, that the impossible things stay where they belong. And if you're reading this account, if you've somehow stumbled across this record of our transformation, then perhaps you're ready to understand why some stories are too dangerous to share, why some truths are too toxic for the unprepared mind to process. The spaces between worlds are vast and patient, filled with entities that view our reality as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be harvested. But they're also protected by guardians who were once human, who remember what it means to love and fear and hope, who use that remembered humanity to preserve the boundaries that keep both worlds safe from contamination by the other. We are still here, still watching, still serving our purpose. And if you ever find yourself driving through the mountains of upstate New York, if you see a rental listing that seems too good to be true for a secluded cabin in the woods, remember this story and choose carefully. Some vacations change you forever. Some prices are too high to pay, no matter how appealing the destination might seem. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The watchers in the forest are patient, and they are always recruiting. If this true story of terror in the wilderness resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more accounts of the impossible things that exist in the margins of our reality. Share your own encounters in the comments below, but be warned that some experiences are too dangerous to discuss in detail. The boundaries between worlds are more fragile than most people realize, and knowledge itself can become a form of contamination that spreads beyond any individual's ability to control. Subscribe now, and remember that some truths are preserved not for entertainment but as warnings for those wise enough to heed them.